Richard Nixon was the only American president ever to have to resign his office in disgrace.
Richard Milhous Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, was born on January 9, 1913. His parents owned a small grocery store in Whittier, California.
The only reason we were able to make it go was because my mother and dad had 5 boys, and we all worked in the store.
He excelled academically and graduated from Duke Law School, then returned to Whittier, California to practice law. He also joined a local drama club.
And there he met another aspiring actor or actress, Thelma Ryan, nicknamed Pat.
They married, and in 1942, Nixon joined the U.S. Navy.
They had 2 daughters, Tricia and Julie.
After the war, Nixon ran for Congress.
He ran against a Democratic congressman named Jerry Voorhees, and he said that Voorhees was a communist sympathizer. It worked, and Nixon was elected.
Nixon was on the House Un-American Activities Committee, which looked into State Department officer Alger Hiss's alleged ties to communism.
Nixon shepherded an investigation that led to Hiss's conviction on perjury charges, and he became a household name almost overnight.
In 1950, Nixon ran for the U.S. Senate and won. 2 years later, General Dwight Eisenhower picked Nixon as his vice presidential running mate.
It was discovered that Nixon had a slush fund of sorts.
Eisenhower was prepared to dump him from the ticket.
Nixon acknowledged the fund, but said it was only used to pay for political expenses he felt shouldn't be billed to taxpayers. But he admitted accepting one personal gift.
It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it.
Eisenhower campaigning, got off the airplane, threw his arm around Nixon and said, "You're my boy."
Eisenhower and Nixon won the 1952 election, and in 1956 they overwhelmingly won re-election. Then in 1960, Nixon ran for president. His Democratic opponent was John F. Kennedy. They squared off in the first televised presidential debate.
Good evening.
JFK looked young and tanned and handsome and vigorous, and Nixon, who had not paid much attention to his makeup, looked kind of sweaty and shifty-eyed, and that was it.
Nixon narrowly lost the election. Then in 1968, he ran again for president.
Nixon understood that the central issue facing the country was the Vietnam War, and he said, "I have a plan that will end this war."
Nixon won the election. In 1969, he began to draw down U.S. troops in Vietnam, while expanding bombing in the north as well as the neighboring country of Cambodia.
He opened relationships and normalized relationships with China. He also created the Environmental Protection Agency.
And then there was Watergate.
In June 1972, there was a break-in at the Watergate offices of the Democratic National Committee. Investigators quickly learned that the burglars had ties to the White House.
They knew all the Watergate burglars. Frank Sturgis would relate to me that E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy would tell them, Richard Nixon wants you to do this, and Richard Nixon wants you to do that. And I just thought it was preposterous until Woodward and Bernstein brought it all out.
The Washington Post reporters learned that the burglars had bugged the Democratic headquarters on orders of Nixon's staffers.
I, Richard Milhous Nixon, do solemnly swear.
Nixon won re-election in 1972, but the Watergate investigation continued.
In recent months, members of my administration and officials of the Committee for the Re-election of the President, including some of my closest friends and most trusted aides, have been charged with involvement in what has come to be known as the Watergate affair.
In February 1974, impeachment hearings began on Capitol Hill. Nixon denied knowing about the break-in. Congress learned the president had recorded his Oval Office conversations.
That really did him in, because all of the suspicions that people had about his involvement in the cover-up of Watergate, came to light in these tapes.
The leaders of the Republican Party on Capitol Hill went down to the White House to tell the President of the United States that he was sure to be impeached in the House.
On August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon gave one final speech from the Oval Office.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
He walks out to that helicopter to take off to go back to California and puts his arms up in the victory sign. A tragic figure at that point. and a tragic time in American politics.
Gerald Ford was sworn in as the 38th president on August 9, 1974. One of his first acts was to pardon Richard Nixon. On April 22, 1994, Richard Nixon died. His public funeral followed 5 days later in his hometown of Yorba Linda, California.
All the living ex-presidents attended. President Clinton was in office then and delivered quite a nice eulogy.
He was honored for his real achievements in opening up China and achieving peace with the Soviet Union and being a fairly effective and activist president.